We continue our exposition of the book of Romans. Today we arrive at chapter 3, verse 26. But for purposes of context, I would like to read verse 25. Whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. Verse 26, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. In verse 26, we see a repeat of what Paul talked about in verse 25, and he repeats the word demonstrate, to display, to show. And so he says in verse 26, that God gives Christ or sets forth Christ as a propitiation and as the expiation of our guilt, so as, or for the purpose of demonstrating at the present time, talking of the dispensation of grace, at the present time his righteousness. He already said that in verse 25, through faith to demonstrate his righteousness. And so verse 26, he says to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness. And I've already labored the meaning of God's justice and righteousness. But he goes on to say in the second part of verse 26, that he, that is God, might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And so Paul splits justice into two words. Firstly, as the object, and therefore that he might be just, that God would be fair, that God would exercise justice. John Calvin would say this word just would mean that there would be no question concerning the grandeur and the majesty and the excellence of God. And therefore, God cannot be questioned, or his justice cannot be questioned. That God might be just. That's why he sets forth Christ. That's why he gives Christ, that he might be just. And we've already looked at that. And secondly, he talks about that he might be the justifier. What this means is that he is the one who is to be appeased, but he's also the one from whom this whole process of justification begins. This is the difference between Christianity and other religions. Because when we talk about a justifier, men and women seek to justify themselves before God. They do their good works. They seek merit. They weigh their conduct on balances, as it were, to test whether their deeds, their good deeds, outweigh their bad deeds. In Islam, that, of course, is the proposition, that you work hard so that your good deeds might outweigh the bad deeds. And if that occurs, if the balances are in the favor of good deeds, then you are admitted to glory. Dear beloved, that is a dangerous place to be if you stand on the edge of eternity. If all a religion could offer is to try and test how far your good deeds have gone before you compared to your bad deeds, then you are doomed. That is not a hope that we would like to have if we stand on the edge of death, on the edge of eternity. Christianity offers something that is more sure, that is more permanent, that is more certain, which is the fact that we do not work hard to merit God's favor, God's justification, or to satisfy God's law. God himself is the justifier. He's the one who declares us out of his own mercy and grace and sacrifice, out of his own setting forth of Christ. He's the originator of that justice by which, when we stand on the edge of eternity, we know we are covered in his righteousness. No matter how many good deeds we have done, we cannot cling to those. Because God himself would say through the prophet Isaiah, your righteousness is like filthy rags. The importance of that statement is that you really have to question if your good deeds are what allows you to be admitted into glory. The question is, what happens to the bad deeds? What happens to the balance of bad deeds? Because ultimately, our bad deeds are not so much what we have done for other people, but what we have done to the glory and for the glory of God. In other words, one sin is treason against the glory of God. And so it's not a matter of how many times I have committed treason. It is the fact that there is the charge of treason on me in the first place. I have already given an example of the fact that I could live my whole life as a good man in society with good standing. I could be friends of my neighbors. I could be generous even and help those in need. I could do all of the good works that good men are expected to do. And then one day I come home and I have murdered one person. If I am charged or sentenced before the law, the judge will not exempt me because I have done good deeds all my life. The judge will sentence me because the sin I have committed is of great gravity by the definition of the law. It does not matter much how many good deeds I have done, because ultimately it is the law that defines the gravity of my sin. In the same way, it is God who defines the gravity of my sin and not myself. And by definition, every sin deserves death. Every sin is treasonous before God. It is usurping his authority. It is arrogance and rebellion of a creature of clay against a grand, majestic, glorious God who is worthy of all excellence, who is worthy of all righteousness that man could summon. And so God defines sin as treasonous. That's why in his wisdom he charges sin with death. The wages of sin, he says, is death. It's not up to me to define sin, let alone to define how many sins or the frequency of sins I have committed. If I have done good deeds all my life and there is one spot of sin in my life, God defines my life as deserving of death. That's the gravity of sin. And so the premise that I can work as many good deeds as possible to outweigh my bad deeds is a wrong premise. Besides, who determines the weight of my good deeds? Ultimately, it's God himself. And so God rescues us from that futile exercise, that fool's errand of thinking that our good deeds, if they outweigh our bad deeds, we would be admitted to glory. Let me suggest to you the following. Number one, that glorious abode that awaits every believer that we all yearn and seek, it belongs to God. He has every right to admit some of us and not to admit others. He has every right to do so, and he would be absolutely just. Number two, that our good deeds are determined by God himself. And so it is possible for me to deceive myself and think that I have done a good work, and yet my motives and the core of my being, my very essence, is sinful. A lot of times we do what Jonathan Edwards would refer to as civil righteousness, acts that seem good on the outside, but the motives are wrong, because I seek to redeem myself in the eyes of men or in the eyes of society. It is possible to act righteously, but deep within, I am rotten. I am a whitewashed tomb. Inside there are but only skeletons, dead bodies inside in terms of my intentions and motives. And so thirdly, it's also important to determine that sin is defined by God, or bad deeds are defined by God and not by man. Ultimately, God who determines my good deeds, or who determines sin, and who determines who to admit in his heaven, that same God becomes the justifier, because he knows that in his own standards, none of us would merit his heaven. None of us would merit his standards or his justification. None of us would be counted righteous by any other means. And so he comes up with a grand plan. That grand plan is Jesus, his son. Therefore, in such act of redemption, God becomes the just, but also the justifier of he who has faith in his Son. Oh, dear listener, that you would cling to Christ the Redeemer, the only hope, the only refuge that we have in time, in this life, and in the life to come.